I think his message is universally appreciated, and not just his protest songs. He had a lot of songs about celebrating, songs about romance. He was a multi-dimensional artist, but he was very skilled at sort of distilling the message to lyrics that were intelligent, but very easily grasped and understood. The message of whoever you are and whatever your background, you have just as much right to get as much out of life as anybody, whatever your economic or your ethnic background. That's something that's eternal.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Online at bookedonrock.com, where you can find every episode along with links to listening platforms, exclusive videos, blogs, and the latest rock book releases. Author Richie Unterberger is this episode's guest. The new book is called Bob Marley and the Wailers, The Ultimate Illustrated History. Illustrated with photos and memorabilia from all phases of their journey, the book illuminates the lives and times of Bob Marley and the Wailers, from their early 60s Jamaican ska beginnings to international stardom by the end of the 70s, right up to Bob Marley's untimely death in 1981. It's all covered in this book, and we have the author, Richie Unterberger, to share some of what's inside. Make sure you visit the show notes page to hear a playlist of Bob Marley and the Wailers. To understand a person's character and the person that they become, we have to go back to our childhood. And we know about Bob Marley's accomplishments as an adult, but where did that, as you write, that burning desire to better not just himself, but the lot of millions of others with similar disadvantages come from? Was his race, his nationality, his modest family assets? Did they have a lot to do with that?
I think all of those factors that you just mentioned did. And although he didn't make such a big deal out of it, he was of mixed race ancestry, and his father was white, quite a bit older than his mother. And his father did not have much to do with his upbringing. I would say was pretty irresponsible. And coming from that mixed race background, Bob may have never felt like he totally fit in with either certainly the white minority ruling class of Jamaica, but also even the Black underclass, which was the majority, the overwhelming majority of the Jamaican population. And by the people living there, he would have always been considered a person of color, but maybe he, because of that background, already felt something of an outsider status, in addition to being one of the many underprivileged people of color in Jamaica, also feeling like he wasn't even entirely fitting in with the Black population of Jamaica. That didn't really manifest itself, I think, too much in his lyrics until maybe the very end of the 60s, when he'd already been recording for a half dozen years or so. But it became a big part of what he and the other original Wailers wrote and sang.
The origins of the Wailers, want to get to that. That starts when Bob meets Bunny Livingston and Peter Tosh as teenagers. I believe they're all born around the mid-40s. And they were not just inspired by the local calypso music, but by the Black American vocal groups like Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, the Platters, and the Drifters. Were they hearing it on the radio? Because you write about the radio in Jamaica being behind the times. So was it hard for them to have access to that music and those records?
On the radio, I think that not just those guys, but anybody in Jamaica could hear a fair amount of the rhythm and blues, early soul music, early rock and roll from the United States, because Jamaica isn't that far from the States, and especially in the late 50s and early 60s, and especially at night, if a station from the southern part of the US had a strong signal, it could carry a pretty long way. So the stations in Miami and in Florida and New Orleans, the accounts vary as to how strongly you would have gotten the signal, but I think that it would have been heard. But also a lot of entrepreneurial Jamaicans, if they were able to go to the United States, cities like New Orleans and Miami, they would buy singles, buy records, come back with them and play them at outdoor parties, outdoor events. It came to be called sound systems when these sort of DJs would play the records they had gotten from the United States. And the Wailers, but certainly all young Jamaicans, I think, would have heard the music of the acts that you mentioned, and Fats Domino, Little Richard, and a little later, the Impressions, led by Curtis Mayfield, who were definitely the biggest influence on the early Wailers as far as their vocal harmonies.
The young Wailers fell under the tutelage of Joe Higgs, often called the father of reggae. Who is Joe Higgs, and how important was he to Bob and the Wailers?
I think Joe Higgs was important to the Wailers, both because he was sort of a mentor to them, an older guy who would go on to his own distinguished reggae music career as a recording artist. But at least Joe Higgs has said that although he could tell that the Wailers had talent when they were just teenagers, they were sort of raw in the way that they hadn't performed very much. Many Jamaicans of their generations hadn't performed much in public. So Joe Higgs apparently was a key factor in teaching them how to harmonize and to blend their talents. All three of them were good lead singers, but they harmonized a lot. So to get them in a group, first of all, getting them to harmonize effectively when two or three of them sang at once, but also sort of divide the material and figure out who was the best lead singer for certain songs was an important part of refining your performance. So he was important in that way.
He also taught Jimmy Cliff, right? Jimmy Cliff is part of the Bob Marley story.
Jimmy
back
Cliff,
in the day.
yeah, he is a part of the Bob Marley story, but not so much as, well, they were hanging out together a lot and they taught each other things, because Jimmy Cliff moved to the United Kingdom a few years before Bob Marley and the Wailers did, and he had international success 3 or 4 years before Marley and the Wailers became globally known. He had a big hit single in the United States, Wonderful World, Beautiful People. I remember hearing that on the radio when I was 7 years old when it came out. It wasn't even called reggae music when it was played on the radio. That's how early it was.
What was it called back then?
It wasn't especially called anything. I think
Yeah.
it would have been called soul music, if anything. And I didn't know Jimmy Cliff was from Jamaica until the early 70s. But an indirect role Cliff played in the Wailers' career is that in the early 70s, when Chris Blackwell of Island Records was on the lookout for a reggae artist he thought that he could promote as sort of a crossover star, that would be an artist who would be popular not just among people of Jamaican ancestry, but for everybody, including white rock listeners. He was considering signing Jimmy Cliff, especially because he knew that when Jimmy Cliff had just starred in The Harder They Come, the very important film for spreading awareness of reggae music and Jamaican culture everywhere, he thought Jimmy Cliff might be a suitable candidate for somebody to record and market as sort of a crossover star. But Jimmy Cliff wanted a deal with a different record label. Maybe that record label offered more money. But around that time, when he couldn't work out something with Jimmy Cliff, he realized that the Wailers were in Britain and they were looking for a record deal. And they were also looking to spread their influence and sales beyond Jamaica to as wide a market as possible. And I don't think it was just a matter of, well, I can take the Wailers because I can't get Jimmy Cliff. I'll settle for something second best. He was on the lookout for something. And with Jimmy Cliff not being available, he was, I think, Chris Blackwell, sincerely impressed by the Wailers, maybe Bob Marley the most of the three Wailers at that time, and thought, well, these fellows and Marley have at least as much potential as Jimmy Cliff would.
The early lineup of the Wailers is interesting to look at it because it grew in the early years. There was Junior, I think it's pronounced Braithwaite.
I think that's right.
And Cherry Green, and then there was a teenager named Beverly Kelso. Do you think early on that they were trying to emulate the American doo-wop groups, or are they just trying to find their way as a group and trying to find their sound?
I think both. And there was, even though Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, and Bunny Livingston, who would later change his name to Bunny Wailer, were the three key guys, there were a good number of people going in and out. And sometimes the reasons they didn't stay didn't solely have to do with the music. Sometimes the members just wanted to do something else. And Junior moved to the United States. He's no longer alive, unfortunately. And it's also interesting that some of the Wailers records, even when some of the people we mentioned weren't in the group anymore, they don't have Bunny Wailer on them because he was in prison for a spell. They might not have Bob Marley on them because he was sort of moving back and forth for at least some trips between Kingston and or Jamaica and Delaware, where his mother had moved in the early 60s and she took an American husband. So the lineup was sort of fluid, but it was obvious those were the three main guys. And then, of course, later they got very talented instrumental players like Family Man to play in the backup group.
Junior
I
took
think
lead vocals too, right? Junior did some lead
yeah,
on some of those tracks, early tracks.
and very prominently, you can hear some of the woman vocalists in the background, those really high notes. I think part of that influence was the Platters and maybe the early Miracles too, because both of those groups, they were mostly male, but they had a prominent woman singer. So they wanted to at least try out that male-female vocal blend. And it didn't just stop when those early members stopped performing with the Wailers, because of course in the 70s, when Bob formed a different lineup with the Wailers without Tosh and Bunny Wailer, the I3s were an extremely important part of the Wailers sound, the backup woman vocalists who included Rita Marley, his wife.
You did state up front in the book that a lot of Bob's early life is a mystery, different accounts and different books about him. Bob fathered his first child in 1963, first of many children, but how many children and how many mothers varies. Most say it's about a dozen births by almost as many women. Were there no hospital records, or what's the story behind the mystery?
Well, even if there are hospital records, if the child is not noted on the record as having Marley as the father, I'm not an expert on Jamaican birth records, or for that matter, when he became a star, he was seeing people who weren't from Jamaica. They might not necessarily tell the full story, but he was just hard to keep up with. It is kind of odd that even with the many children that he had, he was only married once, did not get divorced, and it must have been a complex, untraditional relationship, but he continued to work with Rita Marley as a singer, sometimes Marley, Rita helping with the business his whole life. So their relationship probably went through varying degrees of closeness, but she was always an important part of his music and his life, I think, after the mid-1960s.
You also make clear at the beginning of the book that Marley is often deified as a saint or even a Christ-like figure, but he was like any idolized artist, very human and flawed. Is there any documentation from the women he was with that shed some light on Bob as a partner, as a father? How much of that is known?
There are some of the more prominent ones, not just Rita, but like Cindy Breakspear, have been interviewed about Bob. And whether they're being diplomatic or not, there are very few negative remarks about his character. I'm sure some of them wish, well, we should have had a more solid or maybe more monogamous relationship. But the perception of whether that's a bad thing that he had all these children and relationships, it might vary according to the woman he was involved with and different cultural standards in different places that he was living. And I'm not trying to say, well, I think it was totally okay that he did that. And probably his children, not all of them felt it was okay because they got varying degrees of financial and emotional support. But it's just hard to trace and figure out. And it's not just Bob Marley as a celebrity. You run across this, I want to make clear. Bob Dylan has had relationships with a number of women and children with different women, and he's been subject to much more biographical scrutiny than Bob Marley. And of course, it's easier to trace stuff. But even there were some marriages and children that did not come to light, or at least some partnerships that produced children that did not come to light for many years, about which not much is still known. I'm not talking about his principal partner, Sarah Dillon, but there were other liaisons that produced kids.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this. Bob's debut recordings were as a solo artist, but soon after the Wailers signed a record deal, but they're not getting rich overnight with this deal. Can you talk about their contract and also who Coxsone Dodd was?
Coxsone Dodd ran one of the most prominent studios and labels. They were very intertwined in the 1960s in Jamaica. Many artists recorded for Coxsone Dodd. And I would guess the specifics of a contract, if there even was a contract the whole time they were recording for him, there might not have been one in terms of a document. It's hard to say, but going from reports and interviews, the Wailers made very little money, not because they were specifically being exploited by one record producer and label owner. Virtually all musicians in Jamaica had it rough. And in Jamaica, the charts I've been able to see, I haven't been able to see every week, but there are some that were printed in papers there. They had big hit records in Jamaica, but remember what a small market Jamaica is, it was a substantially poorer country then than it is now. And you could have a number one or a number five record or a few a year and not be able to support a family very well or buy the best clothes that you wanted to perform in when you needed to. One report had it that they were getting like £5 a week, or Marley was, because he was writing in addition to recording, and he was actually helping with other sessions with other artists. And there was a report that he was sleeping on the table of the studio because he didn't really have a permanent base. That's part of the reason that he went to Delaware a few times. Part of it, I'm sure, was to visit his mother, but also, and this sounds weird, it seems like he could make more money doing menial jobs there than he could as a recording star in Jamaica. And again, there are varying reports. What kind of jobs did he have? Some people say he was bussing table, that he was working in a factory, that he was sweeping the factory, that he was on an assembly line, but they weren't prestigious jobs. Nonetheless, part of the reason he went was he would earn money, and his hope was to come back to Jamaica and start his own record label because he was tired of recording for other labels and not getting much money out of it. But before we get to the next question, I do want to emphasize, I think the most important thing about his early years is very interesting, the impoverished circumstances. The most important thing is that he and the Wailers made a lot of good music that's still not extremely well known in the first 10 years of their career. I would say that is the most attractive reason for me to do this book. Of course, I cover his years as a superstar in as much depth, but a lot of people have not heard the first 10 or years or so of his and the Wailers recordings. I think a lot of the music they made during that time is very good, and some of it is even on par with the music that Marley made that were big hit records in the 1970s.
I agree. And I admit also, I'm one of those who didn't hear that portion of his career until doing this episode. And then I put together a playlist that I always put up with each episode. And a lot of the tracks that I include on the playlist that people can hear if they go to the show notes page, there's a link there, never heard before. And you hear the soul influence big time. And there's the Studio One sessions. If you could talk about those scattered across LPs and CD compilations, but worth the effort. You describe the Studio One sides as admirably eclectic, but wildly uneven. Can you describe what they sound like? Because it's not really like the Bob Marley music that you might be accustomed to. It sounds like early soul music.
Before 1967, the Wailers records were like a lot of Jamaican music, not like the reggae that we're familiar with from, say, the early 70s onward. Reggae evolved out of ska music, which was a lot faster. The rhythm of ska is a trademark. It's like dun, 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 but it's not regular 4/4 like soul or rock and roll. There's an accent on the offbeat, so you can tell that it's Jamaican. It's not an American soul music sound. But on those early records with the Wailers from, say, 1964 to 1966, and there are a lot of them. Some of them are really up-tempo, fun party records, like Simmer Down, which was their first really big hit in Jamaica. But on some of them, on the ballads, it's like they're trying to emulate Curtis Mayfield with the impressions. And Rita Marley confirmed Curtis Mayfield was the biggest influence on Bob and the Wailers. They even do some songs which are like 50s doo-wop, like 10 Commandments of Love, but also they're trying some stuff that you wouldn't associate with the Wailers. They do a pretty good version, I would say, of the Beatles' And I Love Her. And
Wow, is that available? I don't think
it is available.
it's
It's
on
on one of
Spotify.
the Heartbeat record CDs. That's our American label. I'm not sure if that compilation is still in print,
Well, I'll add it to the playlist if it's there. I'm going to add it.
but even stranger, and this is not as good, and this is more falling into what I would call uneven. They do What's New Pussycat, the Tom Jones hit, and
Yeah.
that's not really too suitable for them. So they were kind of searching for stuff. They were writing a lot of it. One of their best ska songs from that time, Bob Marley is not on the record because he was in the States, Dancing Shoes, where Bunny Wailer takes the lead vocal. But when Marley came back and was trying to start his own label with a lot of help from Rita, like a lot of ska from that time, the whole Jamaican scene slowed down its rhythms into rock steady, which was kind of the bridge between ska and reggae music, which was kind of slower. But also, I think at the end of the 60s, the influence of the Rastafari faith, which all the Wailers got heavily into, started to influence their lyrics, but not just the lyrics that were sort of religious or spiritual, just get them thinking more seriously about making more sophisticated lyrics with a message. Nothing wrong with the early ska records where it was just like have a good time or I'm in love, like a lot of soul records were from that time. But these influences were combining to make them think of songwriting in a different way. And from throughout that time, we're talking 64 when Simmer Down was their first Jamaican hit through 1972, there are a lot of good records. They get less uneven as far as the quality as time goes on. So by the early 70s, it's a little different than Catch a Fire or Burnin', the first two Island Records albums, but they're a lot more recognizably the kind of music that Marley is most famous for.
One Love is one of the earliest of several Whaler songs that would find a bigger audience when it's re-recorded in the 70s. When was the first version recorded, and does it differ greatly from the 70s version? I know what it sounds like, but for those who may have not have heard that original version.
The original version, which was just primarily for the Jamaican market, it's a lot more like American doo-wop and soul music. And by the time Marley re-recorded it in the mid 70s, and that's the version people are a lot more familiar with, like all of his music, I would say it had more of a rock influence, not in a bad way. And also, this is just the reality. Jamaican recording technology in the mid to late 60s often wasn't that great. When I played, also a teacher of adult education music history courses, most of the students are older than I am. I'm going to be 62 in a few days, but most of them are older, but most of them haven't heard this music. And when I play stuff like Simmer Down and Dancing Shoes, I ask, would you agree this sounds more like a record from 1956 than 1966? And they say, yeah, it sounds more like the Five Satins doing In the Still of the Night than, say, the Temptations doing I Wish It Would Rain, where the production, or My Girl, the production is very clear and sophisticated, does not sound qualitatively different from something recorded today, almost 60 years later. So when I think Marley liked to revisit some songs like One Love, and there were others too, that he knew that when he was recording in London after signing to Island Records, maybe he and the other Wailers felt like they could record it with more depth and presence than was possible when they did it the first time around in Jamaica. So it sounded different, not necessarily, oh, you can't listen to the original because the fidelity is terrible. No, you can listen to the original. They are enjoyable records, but he wanted to do something that had more of a sound that would be approachable by everybody, no matter where they lived.
He gets married to Rita Anderson. That's in 1966. Briefly leaves Jamaica, goes to the U.S. He lives in Delaware. He's not there long, comes back. And let's go back to the Rastafari movement. Chapter 3 titled From Rocksteady to Reggae, 1967 and 1971. And Rastafari, that's a word that I heard and would read from time to time when I learned more about Bob growing up. In 1966, Bob and Rita became followers of Rastafari. What was the Rastafari movement about?
Even having read about it, it's really hard to explain in a paragraph. And I'm saying this not to evade the question, but it's because it's been written about and characterized in quite a few different ways. And the followers of the faith sometimes embrace it for quite different reasons. But I think Afrocentrism is a big part of that faith. And Jamaican blacks, like the African Americans in North America, they usually came here under not just impoverished, but really dehumanizing circumstances. And even with slavery having been outlawed in this country and also in Jamaica, there was still a lot of stigma attached to being black and being a descendant and not having as many rights as the ruling classes in Jamaica and the United States. I know this is a long answer, but you can bear with me here.
That's all right.
With the Rastafari faith, I think it imparted a lot of pride and both social and political empowerment in making African origin something to be proud of rather than something to be, well, we're trying to overcome that and assimilate, or we don't want to think about our origins. At the same time, it was a faith that was distinctly different from the Judeo-Christian faiths that had often been imposed upon slaves and upon the people who moved from Africa to here. And when I say that, I'm not being critical of those faiths per se, just that sometimes elements of those faiths were imposed on the slaves and their descendants without these people of color being aware of alternative faiths. And also, although it's not something I play up in the book, marijuana was and still is a sacrament that's a big part of that faith. Sometimes I think it's embraced for hedonistic purposes, but often at the same time for spiritual purposes, where it's felt this is something that you partake in so that you reach a different spiritual, in addition to physical plane. That's something that was celebrated in much reggae music, legalized by one of the original Wailers. Peter Tosh is probably the most famous example. But all of that, I think, combined to give the Wailers' music a more spiritual cast, not just in this religion is something that's very important to us, but also the way this religion makes us feel better and deal better with the world is a message that can be imparted to the world whether they know about Rastafari religion or not. And I want to make sure people know I wouldn't advocate or condemn that sort of use. I just think it's important to acknowledge as part of what shaped reggae music, and that also that you can enjoy reggae music and Bob Marley's music without partaking in that or feeling like you have to get the most out of the music.
There's a couple songs we know about it. Clapton's cover of I Shot the Sheriff. That wasn't the only Marley song to be turned into a hit by another artist, though. Johnny Nash recorded a song composed by Bob in 1967 called Stir It Up. Nash recorded it in 1972, number 12 single. Talk about Johnny Nash. What kind of artist was he prior to meeting Bob, and how does he and Bob Marley team up? How's that all come to be?
Nash is an American soul singer. It's important to make that distinction. I bet there are some people who might think he's Jamaican because he had that hit, but also the reggae influence in some of his more popular recordings. But he spent some time in Jamaica and became aware of the sort of budding volcano of reggae music much earlier than most Americans and most American entertainers. And he realized pretty early on this music can catch on outside of Jamaica, especially because it has a prominent soul music influence, but it's different enough that people will pay attention to it because it's going to sound like nothing they've heard before. Even in the late 60s, Johnny Nash had some records with a slighter reggae influence, but it was there. But Nash and someone who was involved with his management saw potential for this music, not just in Johnny Nash recording some of this material, but also in working with Bob Marley and Peter Tosh as songwriters, thinking the songs that they are composing, there's a big potential market for them if other people do those songs. I don't think they were fully realizing we can have Marley, Tosh, and Livingston do the songs and have those records, the original versions, be the popular records. I think Chris Blackwell realized that a lot more fully when he signed them to Island Records. Johnny Nash has sometimes been criticized, like sometimes a group like the Rolling Stones would be criticized. Well, you took these blues songs or this blues feel and made it popular, but it should have been the original blues or the original reggae performers who got the recognition and the sales. I don't see it that way. First of all, I think you can have them both. You can have the Rolling Stones and Muddy Waters. You can have Johnny Nash and Bob Marley. They both have qualities they brought to the recordings. But also, I do think that Johnny Nash helped the reggae artists more than he would have hurt them by recording these versions, and people would hear them, like Stir It Up, and a good number of them would be curious enough to figure out this guy Bob Marley wrote them. I want to hear what Bob Marley did. Just like when Eric Clapton had the #1 hit with I Shot the Sheriff, they might realize Bob Marley did this. He does it in an appreciably different way. I want to hear more of Bob Marley stuff.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this. Richie Unterberger, he's the author of Bob Marley and the Wailers, The Ultimate Illustrated History. It's out January 16th. Another guy Bob Marley and the Wailers worked with was Lee Scratch Perry. And in the caption underneath a photo of Lee in the book, you write, quote, one of the most eccentric figures in all of 20th century popular music. Who was Lee Scratch Perry, and what work did he do with Bob and the Wailers?
Lee Scratch Perry was a Jamaican producer who worked with a lot of artists. And also, although he wasn't like a conventional singer with a commercial voice, he put out a lot of his own records. And his early productions, this is going back to the 1960s in Jamaica, they weren't so out of the ordinary, but very quickly he used a lot of studio techniques which were unconventional, not just for Jamaica, but for anywhere, using echo, blending instruments, doing instrumental versions of some vocal songs where he would put on a lot more far out effects, which would be called dub music. And although the association that he and the Wailers had was pretty brief, this is before they were signed to Island Records, he produced some of their most adventurous records, both in terms of the more sophisticated songwriting they were moving into, but also the clearer sound and the deeper sound that they were starting to explore in the studio. Just one feature of that sound, which I think is pretty important, Marley is more known as a singer and a songwriter, and I understand why, but he did play guitar. And that sort of chink-a-chink rhythm that you hear, not just in the Wailers music, but in tons of reggae music, it's like a cliche and a formula now, but it wasn't in the early 70s. And Marley has been credited with devising that sort of style. Dun, 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 that rhythm with a very heavy sort of emphatic guitar strum.
Stir It Up. Yeah, Stir It Up is a big one. Dun, dun,
an electric guitar.
dun, dun.
Well, he devised that, I think. It wasn't Lee Perry who did, but Lee Perry, much more so than I think Coxsone Dodd, could record that and make it an important part of the records without it getting either buried or maybe overwhelming the vocals. The balance in Lee Perry's material was very carefully crafted. As some of the Wailers did with a good number of people in the music business, there were business conflicts with Lee Perry. They kind of fell out. I think that's why they did not do more recordings with them. I think that Chris Blackwell, when he signed the Wailers to Island Records, he had more of a rock sound in mind and wouldn't have wanted Lee Perry to oversee those records. But helping to take the Wailers on the way from being these ska and rock steady artists who didn't have too much experience in the studio to artists who would do reggae that was maybe more accessible to a global audience, I think that Lee Perry was important in doing that without diluting their message. That's a key also to emphasize.
There was a trip to Sweden in 1971 to write music for a soundtrack. Didn't pan out, but Bob wrote a ton of music there. You note in the book. But then there's the international breakthrough of the early 70s. Can you talk about the overseas task at the start of 1972 that would make the Wailers international stars?
It was a lot easier in some ways for Jamaican entertainers to relocate to London than it would have been to the United States, even though the soul music of the United States was such a big influence. And that's because Jamaica had been a colony of the United Kingdom until 1962 when it declared independence. But there was a big, or still is, a huge Jamaican community in Britain and especially in London. And even after declaring independence, it was much easier for Jamaicans to move to Britain and resettle there if they wanted to than it would have been to the United States and get a visa and residence permit for the States and things like that. So the Wailers, when they really wanted to make their listenership much wider than Jamaica, they targeted London. That's where most of the entertainment business was based in the United Kingdom. And they didn't necessarily have Island Records in mind, but in the course of trying to find a record label who would give them international distribution, Island Records turned out to be, I think, the most suitable partner because Chris Blackwell, who was a white Jamaican who had moved to London, Island Records started as principally a reggae or a ska label. It moved into rock music very successfully with artists like Stevie Winwood and Traffic, and then Roxy Music and King Crimson, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Fairport Convention, Cat Stevens. But Chris Blackwell, who was the head of Island Records, knew reggae music really, really well, about as well as any record executive outside of Jamaica would know, because that's what he specialized in the early to mid 60s, selling these reggae and ska records to expatriate Jamaicans who are now living in London. So it was a really good match in that way because Blackwell wanted to start to go back to his roots in a sense and record more reggae music, but not the kind of way he had done it in the early to mid 60s. He had a global market in mind. And it turned out Marley and the Wailers were in London at that time. And they were available and very willing to work with Chris Blackwell in making that transition. They had a hard time getting gigs when they first came there to London. They weren't so well known, even though I think some Jamaicans must have been familiar with the Wailers from records that were being imported because there was such a big market for reggae in London. But it was a confluence, and once they signed and were recording for Island Records, it made sense. Well, now it's time to tour, first starting in London, but then very quickly in the United States. That touring, however, was probably a factor in getting Bob Marley pushed more as the forefront star and Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer to leave the Wailers and start their own careers.
You quote Bob in the book when asked why he came to America when he could have stayed in Jamaica and done just fine. And he said, quote, "A lot of people ask me why I come to America when I can do very well in Jamaica. My answer is that I do want to spread peace and help others. We want to show that the world can get along very well without war, that humans must appreciate others as humans, not by race or religion." Where do you think that mindset came from? His childhood, the Rastafari connection?
I think from a couple of directions. One was that Jamaica sometimes it still is considered a developing nation. It's not materially, it's substantially better than it was in the 60s and 70s. But I think that Marley wanted to represent not just Jamaica, but the people of all nations of that sort from Africa and elsewhere, where the material circumstances were very meager, but maybe more importantly, human dignity and human rights were not as accessible to the huge underclass that was a huge majority of Jamaican population or an African population or populations and others. I think he felt, although he didn't make a big ego deal out of this, that he could be sort of a spokesperson for human rights for the people everywhere who were oppressed. And coming from Jamaica, he certainly would never have been accused of, well, you're speaking for people that you don't know what they're like, because he had gone through that growing up, both in terms of poverty, but also in terms of not having as many rights as the ruling white minority of Jamaica. But to be honest, and I don't think there's anything wrong with this, he saw there was a huge career and economic opportunity for becoming popular in a much bigger market. And in the first 2 years or so when he toured in North America, he had to put in a lot of work to make himself known as a name, but that often meant touring with or supporting other acts, not touring as the headliner. He paid a lot of dues in that regard. And one of the most interesting ads that you find when you go through memorabilia of early Wailers appearances, he and Bruce Springsteen shared the same bill in New York in 1973 at a club when Springsteen was barely known. Springsteen had just put out his first album in 1973. Though those must have been amazing shows because both of those guys must have been hungry leading their bands, trying to make a bigger impact. Not being stars, I mean, Springsteen wouldn't have his first big hit until Born to Run a couple of years later. And I think Marley also realized it doesn't matter so much that someone like Springsteen or Sly Stone, he would also be on a bill with, they're not reggae musicians, but this is going to bring this music to an audience which otherwise might not discover it. And it was, I think, good strategy on his and his record label manager's parts, if they were involved too. I can testify to this. As an 11-year-old in 1973, the first time I heard reggae music was on FM radio when it was more alternative than it would be by the end of the 70s. Most of what FM radio played were like album cuts by Pink Floyd and things like that. But they were very receptive to playing this music on FM radio, and reggae therefore reached a white rock audience it could have never reached in Jamaica, in part because Marley was playing with these rock acts and sometimes soul acts in the United States. So there are quite a few factors that went into this, but I think that was definitely part of what Marley and his associates were thinking.
You mentioned Springsteen, and it makes me think of a question that, as I was reading the book, about Bob, because we know the December 3rd, 1976 shooting was politically motivated, and in the opinion of many. In Rita Marley's memoir, she said Bob had become more important than the prime minister.
Yeah.
Now, I'm too young to know what it was like at that time, but I know there are artists where they start to mix politics with their music, and some fans get turned off by that. With Bob, was there ever any of that? And if not, why do you think that is?
With Bob Marley, I think if anything, his not so much political, but his advocacy of human rights and championing the underprivileged, I think if anything, it really increased his popularity. So much so that certainly within Jamaica, although he didn't run for office and he wasn't blatantly endorsing this candidate or the other, his stature was similar to or greater than in a political figure, certainly among young people. When I say young, not just teenagers, but like people under 40. So it was considered crucial by both of the main political Jamaican parties to get his endorsement if possible. And he didn't want to go out and say, I endorse this party or that party, but I think it was implicit from his message, well, probably the Liberal Party is the one that our listeners are going to be more comfortable with. And that might have motivated the attempt on his and other people in his camp's life, thinking you're playing this concert where the more liberal party has attached itself to the concert without really Bob Marley's endorsement. So therefore, if you play this concert, which was just a few weeks away, it's going to hurt our chances in the election because it's going to be seen, even if you're not coming out and saying I'm endorsing Michael Manley, this candidate, is going to be seen as endorsing him.
And he had that kind of influence too. I mean, he could change somebody's decision as to who they want to vote for.
Yeah, or maybe make some of them think, well, you can go out and vote even if you've never voted before, which is also, in this country, it's also an important consideration. Where still, I don't know what the percentage is, but more than 30% of the population that was eligible to vote did not vote in the last major presidential election. So the same sort of thing happens all over.
Yeah. And he survives the shooting, but ultimately it's cancer that takes his life. And the crazy thing is, if he had his toe amputated, like the doctor suggested, it's likely he would have survived. He didn't want to do that. He was just 36 when he died on May 11th, 1981. He would be 79 next month, if my math is correct.
Yeah.
What do you think Bob Marley would have gone on to do?
Very hard to say, as it is for all rock stars who die young. It's a big list, but for instance, some of the courses I teach are on Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin. Buddy Holly is a big part of my course on rock and roll's first decade. But I will try and answer the question. One of my favorite Bob Marley songs, but also I think one of the most important and impressive, is Redemption Song, which he recorded near the end of his life. And if you heard that song without knowing anything else about Marley's career, you wouldn't think this is a reggae artist, I think. You might think he's a folk music artist, or what we call in the States a singer-songwriter, like Joni Mitchell or somebody like that. If he had not been ill, I think without ever losing reggae as a big part of his music, he might have started to branch into other sorts of music, like you hear in Redemption Song. I think with the ascendancy of awareness of world music, especially from Africa in the 1980s, he might have been interested in using some of those qualities, the rhythmic and some of the instruments you hear in African music of Fela or King Sunny Ade or Ali Farka Touré in his music, without imitating it, just integrating it like a lot of artists do, like the Beatles did, like Joni Mitchell would do when she went into more jazz type music. And I don't always have big hopes for collaborations with other artists. Usually they're more disappointing on paper or in reality than they are on paper. But perhaps he could have done collaborations with
You just
people.
read my mind. I was going to ask about, if he would do that.
Yeah,
like do a collaboration with the Clash or the Police, who were influenced by the reggae sound.
Yeah, or
Yeah.
other artists of color who weren't from Jamaica, like Prince or somebody like that.
Right. Yeah.
Or Stevie Wonder. That might be a better example because Stevie Wonder, I think, is closer to Marley's generation and closer to his music.
And
But you can see some potential there.
Right around the time he died, they said he was going to do a co-headlining tour with Stevie Wonder.
Yeah, which would have been, I think, great for both of them because Stevie Wonder was aware of reggae music. Obvious example, Boogie on Reggae music, Boogie on Reggae Woman, a hit for him. Bob Marley was certainly aware of what soul musicians were doing. I don't think necessarily by them touring together, their next album, suddenly you might think, well, they almost sound like they're combining their music, but there could have been subtle influences that would have been interesting. So that is something I think that might have happened. Also, I think he might have wanted to work even more extensively with other artists as a producer, songwriter, mentor. One of the goals of Tough Gong, which he and the Wailers were important in helping get off the ground, was for it to be a sort of a Motown Records of Jamaica, like Motown was with Detroit, where it wouldn't just be a good studio that people could use. A lot of songwriters, session musicians, even promoters and publicists, record producers could sort of feed off of each other. And it could be sort of a hothouse producing all this great music like Motown was for soul music in the 60s and early 70s. Tough Gong has done a lot of stuff, but I don't think it ever got to that level that Marley was maybe envisioning of being like the Motown of reggae music, or just a Motown where it wasn't just reggae, but lots of cool music was coming out of there.
I wonder, would Bob Marley have gotten more involved with politics? Would he have
I
run
don't
for?
know. I think he was suspicious of organized politics, and going what we go through here in the United States on a daily basis, you might understand that he might want to promote values that should be adopted and encouraged rather than, well, here's a political candidate and we want them to attack someone else in a debate, which many of us in the United States, even if we're in favor of one or the other of the candidates, we're like, well, we want results. We don't, we want people to enact this in their lives and policies to improve people's lives rather than let's get on the floor of Congress or the Parliament and fight it out. I think he was reluctant to get involved in endorsing and heavily campaigning in that way. But I might be mistaken, or he might, at least in subtle ways, have said, hey, this is at least something you can do, organize in your communities. Even if you're not really happy with the candidates, vote for whoever you can to make some change possible. We don't know. It's certainly possible.
Bob Dylan's still recording to this day, and he's 80, I think.
Yeah. Although he's
So,
never been one to say, I support this candidate. I mean,
right.
even when Obama was in office, I think it was a Rolling Stone interview, but it was a major interview. He was like evading the question, well, who would you support? And I don't agree with how Dylan approached this. It was more like, well, I don't really want to be pinned down to anything. My thought would be, well, when there's obvious differences between these political philosophies, why wouldn't you say I support this one rather than the other one? But that's not the way Dylan thought.
Yeah. We should leave out Bunny and Peter. What became of Bunny Livingston and Peter Tosh? Unfortunately, a tragic ending to Peter Tosh's life.
To backtrack a bit, a couple of the things I wanted to cover most in the book, which is a survey of Bob Marley's career, to give a lot of space to his first 10 years before he became globally known, not just for his life, but the many good records he and the Wailers made in varying styles. But also, luckily, and it's because the title of the book is Bob Marley and the Wailers, it's not just Bob Marley, I did have the opportunity to both discuss Tosh and Wailers' contributions to the Wailers when they were in the group, but also some of their solo career. And this will be kind of a big answer, but I think it's important to know that when they were both in the Wailers with Bob Marley, they weren't just side musicians or doing occasional things or backup harmony singers. They were full members of the group. They did some songwriting and lead singing and collaboration. It's a rough comparison, but I wish that they had been able to do one or two more albums with all three of the guys in the group after they signed to Island, because all of them could have written and sang. And just in the way you hear the White Album or something, where there's some Lennon songs, McCartney songs, and some Harrison songs, they blend together very well, but they all have different viewpoints and different vocal personas. I think if they had done a double album utilizing all three of those guys' talents, it would have possibly been a knockout and really impressive.
Like a White
Because
Album.
yeah, and because Island wasn't going to spring for a double album to begin with, and because Marley, to some degree, was being focused on as the star at the expense of some of Tosh and Wailers' material, they separated from the Wailers pretty early on. But as solo artists, they did interesting things. Peter Tosh had, and I say this as a compliment, a somewhat rawer, blunter style, like laying it out. Legalize It, it's his most famous song, but that's an example. A lot of reggae songs, they kind of refer to marijuana use. Peter Tosh isn't just going to refer to that. He's going to advocate for what he thinks should be a policy towards marijuana users. Bunny Wailer kind of had like a sweeter, more romantic tone. He didn't write as much as Tosh and certainly as Marley, but he was worth hearing for what he could voice in that way. And of course, fortunately for him, he got to live a lot longer. not just do a lot more records, but kind of carry on some of the message of the Wailers a lot longer than Marley could, who died in the early 80s, and Tosh was shot to death in the late 80s when he was still in his mid 40s. There could have been a lot more music that he could have done. So in a book like this, I think it's important to note, not just in footnotes, but some descriptions of their records and their activities. These guys carried on the message of the Wailers after they left Bob Marley, and it's well worth hearing what they did after they were not in the same group.
And Bunny only passed a few years ago.
Yeah,
I think
he had
2021. A couple strokes.
Of course, yeah, all lives, if you make it into your 70s and you don't get it any farther, we all want our lives and those who we value to be longer, but it was a lot longer than Peter and Bob's. And he got to also get a lot of recognition because he was sort of an elder statesperson. I don't attach too much importance to awards, but he got, awards in the United States for a few of his records.
Talk about the legacy of Bob Marley and the Wailers, because that's, like you say, the book is about Bob Marley and the Wailers. What is their legacy?
More than almost any other artist, the Beatles are a notable exception. They, and especially Marley, have had a multi-generational following, which seems to me not be in danger of diminishing, which is just amazing. I mean, Elvis Presley is a great artist. Everyone knows who he is, but really, not as many people listen to and buy his records as they did, like even in the 1990s or in 2000. Doesn't mean he's any less of an artist, but he doesn't have that eternal appeal and mystique. And Bob Marley's has just grown and grown. Of course, you see his T-shirts and his handbags everywhere, but a lot more important than the merchandise, I think his message is universally appreciated, and not just his protest songs. This is something else I'd like to emphasize. He had a lot of songs about celebrating, songs about romance. He was a multi-dimensional artist, but he was very skilled at sort of distilling the message to lyrics that were intelligent, but very easily grasped and understood, including by people who don't speak English as their primary language. I went to Sicily 6 years ago, and for the entertainers on the street who were just playing for change, the most frequent material you heard, aside from songs by John Lennon and Paul McCartney, were Bob Marley songs, like Get Up, Stand Up.
Yeah.
The most popular songs, the ones that you see, that you hear on The Legend, Jamming, certainly. Lively Up Yourself. I don't know how that missed being on Legend. That's the song that should have been on Legend that's not, but that's the song that gets played a lot. But I think the message of whoever you are and whatever your background, you have just as much right to get as much out of life as anybody, whatever your economic or your ethnic background. That's something that's eternal. And we might not live to see that take hold in as big a way as Bob Marley did, but that's a great goal to strive for. And you can do that and have fun at the same time because the music is very accessible.
Bob Marley and the Wailers, The Ultimate Illustrated History. It's out January 16th. That is next week. You can order it through all the usual outlets. It's from Motor Books. And people can find you online. Richie, you have your own website, and I already have the link ready to go. It's in the show notes page. And lots of things that people can find on there, including some courses that you teach that people can find out about on your website, richieunterberger.com.
Yes, I teach adult education courses, and one of maybe the only really good thing about having to adjust the way we live after the pandemic is almost everybody uses Zoom now, and the classes are available on Zoom. I don't want to make this too much of a commercial. I'm based in the Bay Area, but if you're interested, even if you don't live in the Bay Area, you can be in Connecticut like you are, or Florida, or Mexico, Canada. I've had students from Mexico and Canada. You can tune into the courses. And if you don't want to pay a fee, but just sample what I do, twice a month for a San Francisco nonprofit, San Francisco Community Living Campaign, I do 90-minute shows on specific artists and styles using a lot of audiovisual material. And the information for logging into those, it's on my website on the What's New section.
Thanks so much for doing this, Richie, and congrats on the book.
Thank you.
That's it. It's in the books.